The air was deathly still, thick with a tension that clung to them like a shroud. Mia's final scream echoed in their minds, swallowed by the oppressive darkness that had enveloped them. Silence followed. A silence so profound it suffocated, as if the very air had turned hostile. The maze, once a puzzling curiosity, had fully revealed its true nature, a ravenous beast, feeding on their fear and despair. Each scream, each drop of blood, seemed to fuel its insatiable hunger. Emma's chest heaved, her breath sharp and shallow as she stared at the spot where Mia's body had fallen. The grotesque willow tree, now sated, had released her lifeless form with a sickening thud. The earth beneath was soaked in blood, yet even that seemed to disappear, as if the ground had absorbed the horror, leaving only the memory of Mia's death. Emma's mind swirled with horror, but she couldn't let herself crumble. Mia was gone. The maze had claimed another victim. The ground where Mia had collapsed was eerily smooth now, as though it had swallowed her suffering whole, leaving no trace but the stain of blood and the chill of her absence. Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. This maze wasn't just a physical labyrinth. It was alive, a living nightmare, and it was hunting them. The vines around them quivered as if sensing their despair. The blackened roses pulsed with a sinister rhythm, matching the pounding of their hearts. For a moment, Emma felt as though the maze itself was watching, its cruel gaze fixed on her and the others, waiting for their next move. "God, she's really gone," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible, his hands still trembling from his futile attempt to save Mia. His eyes were locked on the spot where she had been, as if unable to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before them. Emma couldn't bear to look at him. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice strained. She scanned the towering walls of thorns, their barbed tips gleaming with fresh blood. The walls seemed closer now, like prison bars tightening around them. Mark, pale and bloodied from his earlier wounds, leaned heavily against one of the thorny walls. His breath was ragged, and with each gasp, a fresh trickle of blood stained the ground beneath him. "It's using us," he rasped. "The more we panic, the stronger it gets." He was right. The maze wasn't just a trap, it was a predator, growing stronger with every moment of their terror. Mia's death had fed it, made it more alive, more determined to consume them all. Emma's legs felt weak, but she couldn't afford to stop. "If we stay here, it'll kill us too." Jake's face was ghostly pale, his voice shaking with disbelief. "Mia's gone, Sophie's gone, we're not getting out of this, are we?" His words hung in the air like a death sentence. For a brief moment, Emma felt the weight of truth in them. Was there really no way out? Would they all become just another part of this living nightmare? "No," she said firmly, forcing herself to stand taller. "We have to keep moving." Jake's lips quivered, but he nodded slowly. Mark coughed weakly, his strength fading, his face etched with pain and defeat. His resignation was clear. He knew, as did Emma, that their chances were slipping away with each passing second. The ground beneath them groaned ominously, the earth sagging under their feet like a mouth ready to devour them. The walls shifted again, narrowing the once spacious path into a suffocating corridor. The thorns twisted and reached inward, closing in like the jaws of a predator. Emma's pulse raced. The maze was tightening its grip, waiting for them to break. But they couldn't give it what it wanted. They had to keep going. The plants around them seemed to quiver with anticipation. The roses darkened to the color of dried blood. The maze exhaled, its breath hot and oppressive, pushing them deeper into despair. "We can't stop now," Emma urged, her voice trembling but resolute. The weight of the maze pressed down on her, its unseen eyes watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. "If we do, it'll kill us." Emma glanced once more at the spot where Mia had been taken. The sightless eyes, the terror frozen on her face, it was all too much. For a split second, the weight of her failure washed over her like a tidal wave. Maybe if she had reacted faster, Mia would still be alive. The thought clawed at her insides, threatening to unravel her, but she shoved it away, locking it behind the door of her mind. There would be time to grieve later. If there was a later. Jake's face was pale, his eyes wild with fear. "What chance do we have? We've been running in circles. The maze won't let us go." His voice trembled, the hopelessness in his tone almost contagious. Emma's heart pounded, a flicker of doubt creeping in. She forced herself to stay focused, tightening her grip on the small shard of hope they had left. "We don't have a choice. We have to keep moving," she said, her voice strained but resolute. The weight of failure pressed on her chest like a boulder, but she couldn't let it crush her. Mark's breaths were labored, his blood staining the ground beneath him, each step more burdensome than the last. His face was drawn, his skin ashen. "She's right," he muttered between gasps. "The maze is shifting again. If we don't move, we'll be next." Emma noticed how he leaned heavily against the thorny wall, each breath shallow and pained. The maze was toying with them. She could feel it, taste it in the air, like a predator playing with its prey. The ground beneath their feet felt soft, unstable, like it could swallow them at any moment. The walls around them pulsed with hunger, tightening their grip. The roses twitched, their petals curling inward like claws, as if waiting to strike. "We have to move," Emma repeated, her voice steadier this time, but her mind buzzing with the overwhelming pressure of survival. "We can't let it win." As they pressed on, deeper into the maze, Emma's gaze flickered back once more to where Mia had disappeared. The vivid image of her terror-stricken face etched in her mind. Every step forward was a fight against the crushing despair that seemed to weigh down more heavily with each passing second. She knew that every movement now was a gamble. Each step could be their last. They stumbled deeper into the maze, their steps uneven, guided only by ration and the faint hope that somewhere there was a way out. But the air had grown heavier, saturated with a sweet, cloying scent that invaded their senses. Emma blinked rapidly, trying to clear her head, but with every breath, the fog thickened in her mind. The walls of the living laurel shimmered in the dim light, their leaves glistening with dew that dripped deliberately onto the earth. The plants bent and warped, their shapes shifting into grotesque figures, twisted faces emerging from the bark, their eyes hollow and menacing. "Do you see that?" Jake's voice wavered, thick with confusion. His hand reached out toward the shadows, trembling. His eyes were locked on something in the distance, something only he could see. Emma followed his gaze, and her stomach turned cold. Through the mist, a figure emerged, ghostly pale, its eyes wide and hollow. It moved slowly, its limbs swaying as if it were caught in a trance. Her heart raced as the figure drew closer, revealing itself in the dim haze. It was Mia. Or at least something that looked like Mia. Her skin was pale and taut, her clothes torn and stained with blood. Her arms were outstretched, her mouth twisted into a unnatural grin. "Mia," Jake's voice cracked, his hand reaching for her as if in disbelief. Jake's mind felt like it was swimming in mud. His thoughts were clouded, his emotions raw. He wanted so badly for this nightmare to be over, for Mia to be alive. Maybe, just maybe, if he reached out, she would come back. His breath hitched, his body leaning forward as if the thought of her survival was the only thing keeping him sane. "But it's her. I see her." Jake's eyes filled with desperation. He moved toward the figure, but Emma yanked him back with all her strength. "That's not her," she shouted, shaking him. "Mia's gone. The maze is in our heads. It's trying to break us." Jake's body swayed, his eyes still locked on the phantom figure. The fog thickened, swirling around them, distorting reality. Emma's vision blurred as the ground rippled beneath her feet. Shadows danced at the corners of her eyes, flickering like phantoms in the mist. Mark's voice broke through the haze, hoarse and trembling. "It's toying with our minds. We can't trust anything we see." The words barely registered as the figure of Mia loomed closer, her hollow eyes boring into them. Jake's hand reached out again, brushing against the slick leaves of the living laurel. The plant reacted instantly, its leaves curling around his wrist like a snake coiling around its prey. "Jake!" Emma screamed, lunging forward, but the vines tightened, pulling him toward the twisted wall. Jake's face twisted in confusion and terror as the leaves snaked up his arm, their thorns glinting in the dim light. Emma grabbed his other arm, yanking him back with all her strength, her fingers slipping on his bloodied skin. The vines hissed and snapped, releasing him reluctantly, and Jake stumbled backward, gasping for air. "They're in our heads," Mark said again, his voice barely a whisper. "We can't trust our eyes." Emma's pulse pounded in her ears. The maze wasn't just trapping their bodies, it was invading their minds, warping their senses, manipulating their fears. She swallowed hard, forcing the image of Mia out of her mind. She had to stay focused. They couldn't let the maze break them. The path ahead wavered like a mirage, the air thick with the sickly sweet scent of the living laurel. Emma's thoughts felt slow, her limbs heavy as the plants around her swayed. Their leaves shimmered with a sticky substance, dripping onto the ground like poison. Each step felt like walking through quicksand. The ground shifted beneath her, unstable, as if it could give way at any moment. "We're trapped," Jake muttered, his voice thick with panic. His hands shook uncontrollably, his breath ragged. "It's all over." Emma's head swam, her senses dulling under the relentless pressure of the maze. The plants seemed to close in on them, their vines twitching, ready to strike. But amidst the fog clouding her mind, Emma felt something else, a pulse, a rhythm. It wasn't just the plants. The air itself felt alive, thick and pulsing with a rhythm that matched her racing heart. The maze didn't just want their bodies, it craved their terror. Every cry of pain, every scream, only seemed to feed it. The blackened roses throbbed as though drinking in their suffering, and Emma realized with a chilling certainty that the maze was starving for their fear, growing stronger with every ounce of despair. Emma nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow, her muscles tensing. "We can't let it win," she muttered. Her voice, though quiet, carried the weight of their situation. Giving up meant death. Jake's breathing was uneven, his eyes wide with fear. "How do we even fight something like this? It's like it's inside our heads." Emma didn't answer, but she felt the truth in Jake's words. The maze was inside them, feeding off their hopelessness, twisting their thoughts. The more they let the fear seep in, the more powerful it became. The plants weren't attacking randomly. They were moving in sync with a purpose. The maze was a predator, alive and cunning, but it had a rhythm, a pattern. If she could time it... "We have to move," Emma whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "Now." She squeezed her eyes shut, focusing on the sound of the maze. The faint rustling of the vines, the low hum of the plants. It was all connected, part of the same rhythm. If she could follow it, she might be able to outmaneuver it. With a sudden burst of clarity, Emma yanked Jake forward. "Run!" They sprinted through the twisting corridor, the plants snapping at their heels. Emma didn't dare look back. She could hear the vines lashing out, barely missing them. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she kept pushing forward, her mind locked on the rhythm of the maze. Mark stumbled, his breathing shallow as he struggled to keep up. Blood dripped steadily from his arm, leaving a trail behind them. The scent of iron mixed with the stench of decay, and Emma knew the maze could sense it. It was feeding with each drop, growing stronger. They turned a corner and found themselves face to face with a grotesque wall of venomous pitcher plants. Their trumpet-shaped mouths gaped wide, dripping thick, syrupy liquid that hissed as it hit the ground. The plants hummed with an eerie vibration, the air around them thick with the scent of decay. "We're trapped again," Mark gasped, his voice weak. His eyes darted around, wide with panic. "There's no way out." The vines behind them writhed, closing in, their needle-like thorns glinting in the pale light. Emma's mind raced. The maze was tightening its grip. If they didn't move soon, they'd be consumed. "We fight," Emma said through gritted teeth, though her voice wavered with doubt. "We don't give up." But even as she spoke, the ground shifted again beneath her feet, a low rumble vibrating through the earth. The plants around them twitched, their vines curling inward, tightening the walls of the maze. They were running out of time. Just as they took their first hesitant step forward, the ground erupted beneath them. The soil split open with a violent crack, and from the dark, gaping wound in the earth, thick vines shot up like living tendrils, snaking around their legs, arms, and throats. The maze, which had been toying with them, was no longer waiting. It had decided to claim its prey. "Mia!" Jake screamed, his voice raw, as if her name could somehow banish the terror closing in on them. The vines constricted around him like a noose, their thorns biting into his skin, drawing thin streams of blood. Emma struggled against the vines, her body jerking as the thorns dug deeper into her flesh. The more she fought, the tighter the vines became, winding around her chest and neck, choking the breath from her lungs. Her vision blurred as the pressure built, her mind spinning with panic. Mark's breathing had become shallow, each gasp more labored than the last. His earlier wounds bled steadily, staining the ground beneath him, as though the maze itself was feeding on his very life force. His legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed into a heap. I can't go on," Mark whispered, his voice barely a rasp. But the maze had no mercy. With a sudden, violent pull, the vines yanked him toward a massive, venomous pitcher plant, its acid-dripping jaws looming closer. Steam hissed from the ground where the acid had splattered, and the plant's thick saliva stretched down like molten glass. Mark let out a choked cry, his hands scrabbling against the earth as the plant inched nearer, its gaping maw wide and waiting. "Mark!" Emma screamed, lunging forward, but the vines snapped back, pinning her to the ground. Her fingers clawed at the dirt, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The thorns coiled tighter around her, sinking deep into her skin, drawing more blood that seeped into the dark soil. The maze pulsed with hunger, feeding on their fear and pain, tightening its grip with each passing second. Mark's screams tore through the clearing as the pitcher plant loomed over him. With a horrifying squelch, the plant's jaws closed around him, the sickening sound of dissolving flesh filling the air, his cries abruptly cut off as the plant devoured him. Emma turned away, bile rising in her throat, the horror of what she had just witnessed too much to bear. Jake's body jerked as he slashed at the vines with a sharp rock he had grabbed as he was being dragged. His hands were slick with blood, his face twisted in desperation. He managed to free one arm, but the vines coiled tighter around his legs, dragging him relentlessly toward the waiting pitcher plant. "Help me!" Jake's voice cracked, his body thrashing as the vines yanked him closer to the plant's maw. His fingers dug into the earth, trying to hold on, but it was no use. The plant's jaws gaped wide, its acid bubbling as it dripped onto the ground, sizzling with anticipation. "Jake?" Emma screamed, her voice hoarse with panic. She lunged forward, but the vines around her chest and legs held her in place. She watched helplessly as the pitcher plant's grotesque mouth opened wider, the acid dripping down onto Jake's legs, burning his flesh. Jake let out a blood-curdling scream, his eyes locking with Emma's for one brief, terrible moment. His face was twisted in agony, his mouth open in a silent cry as the plant's jaws closed around him. The sound of sizzling flesh and muffled screams filled the air as the pitcher plant devoured him whole. Emma's chest heaved as she collapsed to the ground, the vines loosening around her ankles as if the maze had finally sated its hunger. Her breath came in ragged, uneven sobs, her body trembling uncontrollably. "They're all gone," she whispered, the weight of the words crushing her. She was the last one standing. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of the pitcher plant digesting its meal. The maze had claimed its next victims, but Emma knew it wasn't done. It wouldn't stop until it had claimed her too. Her body screamed in pain, but her mind began to clear. She had survived this long by refusing to give in to the terror that had taken the others. The maze had its traps, its patterns, but Emma had noticed something. Each attack had a rhythm, a timing. The plants didn't strike randomly. They recoiled before they lashed out, pulling back like a predator ready to pounce. Emma's heart pounded as she forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. She had to keep moving. The maze was still hungry, and she wasn't going to give it another chance to devour her. She wiped the blood from her face, her breathing steadying as she listened to the faint rustling of the vines. The plants were waiting, coiling back, preparing to strike. Emma clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. 3, 2, 1. She darted forward just as the vines lashed out behind her, missing her by mere inches. The wind whistled past her ears as she sprinted through the narrow corridor, her breath coming fast and shallow. Her muscles burned, but she kept going, refusing to stop. The path ahead twisted, the walls of thorns closing in on her. The vines recoiled again, readying for another strike. Emma's heart raced as she counted the beats in her head, timing her next move. 3, 2, 1. She threw herself to the right just as another vine shot out, narrowly avoiding the deadly thorns. The walls around her seemed to close in, their barbed tips scraping her skin as she pushed forward. But she didn't look back. She couldn't. The maze was learning her patterns, adapting just as she was. She had to stay one step ahead. Finally, she skidded to a halt in a small clearing. The thorns loomed around her, pulsing with life, but for the moment, they were still. Emma's chest heaved as she caught her breath, her eyes scanning the twisted walls for any sign of movement. She was alive, for now. But the maze wasn't done with her. It was always watching, always waiting. Her muscles ached, her body battered and bruised, but Emma wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "We're not done," she muttered under her breath, her hands tightening into fists. Not yet. The path led Emma into a large, open clearing at the heart of the maze. The oppressive air seemed to weigh heavier here, as though the very center of the labyrinth was alive with malice. The roses were no longer dark red, they were black, their petals twisted and dripping with thick crimson liquid that oozed like fresh blood. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as her eyes darted around, taking in the grotesque sight. She had come too far to turn back now. The maze had claimed everyone else, but she was still standing. The walls around her seemed to pulse and shift, the slick black vines snaking down from the ceiling, forming a grotesque cage around her. The ground buckled, cracking like dried skin beneath her feet. It was as though the very pit was closing in, pulling her deeper into its maw. The oppressive heat radiated from the earth, suffocating her as the vines twisted and stretched, their sharp thorns dripping with a strange glowing sap. It felt like she was in the very belly of the beast, and every breath she took felt heavy, laced with the scent of decay and blood. Emma slashed wildly with the rock she had found earlier, striking at the vines as they closed in on her. The maze recoiled for a moment, hissing like a wounded animal, but she could feel it pressing closer, suffocating her with its relentless hunger. The vines were relentless, coiling back around her legs, snapping faster, more viciously. She hadn't realized she was holding the same rock Jake had used in his desperate fight for survival. Before she could react, the ground split open beneath her, vines shooting up and wrapping around her legs with lightning speed. She was yanked off her feet, the thorns biting into her skin as they dragged her toward the center of the clearing. Every inch she was pulled, the thorns seemed to dig deeper, like claws determined to tear her apart. A massive shadow loomed ahead, shifting and writhing within the darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly, cold and malevolent, its form twisted and distorted, with vines and thorns sprouting from every part of its body, blending into the maze itself. Emma's breath hitched as the realization dawned. The shadow, it was the man from the portrait in the mansion. But he was no longer just a man. His body had become a grotesque fusion of human and plant, vines coiling around his limbs and thorny branches jutting from his skin. His face, once preserved in paint, was now warped, his features twisted by the maze's dark essence. This creature, this thing, was the maze. He had been watching them all along, manipulating the plants, guiding them to the center of the maze. This wasn't just a trap, it was a predator, and she was its final prey. The vines tightened around her throat, choking the air from her lungs. She gasped, her hands clawing at the vines, but they held firm, squeezing tighter with every breath she tried to take. The pressure was unbearable, her vision beginning to blur at the edges, but Emma wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. With a surge of desperate strength, she yanked her body sideways, slashing at the vines with the jagged rock. The thorns hissed as they loosened their grip, giving her just enough time to break free, though her skin burned from where they had dug into her flesh. But the shadow loomed closer, its glowing eyes fixed on her. The vines twisted and writhed around it, as though they were an extension of its malevolent will. The maze was no longer just a labyrinth of plants. It was a living, breathing thing, and it wanted her. Emma's heart raced as the ground gave way beneath her again, the earth crumbling like ashes. She was pulled deeper, deeper into the dark heart of the maze, into the jaws of the creature that had been toying with them all along. The clearing, the vines, the roses, it was all part of this entity, and now it had her. With every breath labored, every muscle screaming in exhaustion, Emma knew this was the final fight. She wasn't just battling to escape, she was battling to survive the maze itself. Emma's body plummeted into the abyss, the air rushing past her in a deafening roar. Her fingers scrambled for something, anything to grasp onto. But the walls around her were slick and jagged. She hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. For a moment, the world spun in and out of focus, her vision dark and blurred. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. The air here was colder, thicker, like she was deep within the belly of the beast. This was no longer the maze above, it was something far worse. The ground was no longer made of soil and thorns, but of twisted roots and tendrils that pulsed beneath her feet. The walls around her were smooth, their surfaces slick and black, reflecting the faint glow of a dim, unnatural light that seemed to emanate from the depths of the pit. It felt alive, as if the very earth beneath her feet was breathing, waiting for the right moment to devour her whole. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she took in her surroundings. The walls closed in on her from all sides, twisting and curling like a living organism. The maze had led her here. This was the heart of it, the core where the true horror resided. She wasn't meant to escape. She heard the sound of slithering vines from above, shifting and curling like serpents in the dark, and she knew that whatever had dragged her here was not going to let her leave without a fight. The maze was tightening its grip, eager to finish what it had started. Emma's hands shook as she fumbled for the jagged rock she had used before, the only weapon she had left. Her body was battered and bloodied, her muscles aching from exhaustion, but she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Her eyes scanned the pit, searching for a way out. The ceiling above was too high to climb, and the walls were too smooth and slick to offer any foothold. But there had to be something, some way to escape this living nightmare. And then she saw it. At the far end of the pit, hidden in the shadows, was an archway, a tunnel carved into the earth, its edges glowing faintly with the same unnatural light that illuminated the pit. It was narrow and jagged, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was her only chance. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she staggered toward the tunnel, every step sending a jolt of pain through her bruised and battered body. The walls around her seemed to pulse with life, the roots beneath her feet shifting and curling as if they could sense her movement. The slithering sound of the vines grew louder, closer, as if the maze knew she was trying to escape. She reached the entrance to the tunnel just as the ground beneath her began to tremble violently. Thick vines shot up from the earth, wrapping around her ankles, yanking her backward with a force that sent her sprawling onto the ground. The jagged rock flew from her hand, skittering across the pit as the vines coiled around her legs and arms, pinning her in place. Emma screamed, thrashing against the vines, but they only tightened their grip, pulling her closer to the center of the pit. Her fingers clawed at the earth, her heart racing as she fought to free herself, but the vines were too strong, their barbs slicing into her skin with every movement she made. Above her, the massive shadow loomed closer, its glowing eyes fixed on her. The creature was no longer a distant figure. It was here, in the pit with her. Its hulking form writhed and twisted as it approached, its body made of the same black, twisting vines that had ensnared her. It was the maze, the living heart of it, and it had come to claim her. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she realized the truth. There was no escape. This creature, this thing, was the very embodiment of the maze. It had been watching her, guiding her, manipulating the plants and paths to lead her here, to this moment. It had taken Mia, Mark, Sophie, and Jake, and now it was going to take her too. But Emma wasn't ready to let it win. With a final surge of strength, she twisted her body, slashing at the vines with her bare hands. The thorns bit into her skin, drawing blood, but she didn't care. She had to fight. She had to survive. The vines hissed and recoiled, loosening their grip just enough for Emma to break free. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she staggered toward the tunnel. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, the sound vibrating through the pit as it lunged toward her, its massive body writhing and twisting with terrifying speed. Emma threw herself into the narrow tunnel just as the creature's vines slammed into the ground behind her. She crawled through the tight space, her body scraping against the jagged walls as she fought to escape. The tunnel was narrow and winding, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and rot. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The tunnel was tight, the walls pressing in, suffocating her with their weight. But as she pushed forward, something changed. The air grew colder, thicker, and with each step, a faint glow flickered ahead. Her legs trembled as the ground leveled beneath her feet. The walls of the tunnel widened, giving way to a circular chamber that loomed ahead, oppressive in its silence. Just when she thought she couldn't go any further, the tunnel opened up into another clearing, a vast circular chamber lit by the same eerie glow. In the center of the room stood a massive, pulsating tree, its roots tangled and gnarled, its bark black and slick like the walls of the pit. And at its base, buried in the tangled roots, was an ancient, rusted gate. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled toward the gate. It was old, covered in moss and rust, but it was her only hope. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she grabbed the cold iron bars, her heart pounding in her chest. The gate creaked as it swung open, the sound echoing through the chamber. Behind her, the creature roared, its vines slithering into the chamber, reaching for her, desperate to pull her back into the heart of the maze. Emma threw herself through the gate just as the vines closed in. The iron bars slammed shut behind her, the creature's vines slamming against the gate with a deafening crash. The force of the impact sent her sprawling onto the ground. But she didn't care. She was free. She had made it through. The creature let out one final, anguished roar, its glowing eyes burning with fury as it thrashed against the gate. But the iron held strong, keeping the maze at bay. Emma lay on the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had survived. The maze had claimed her friends, but it hadn't claimed her. For now, as Emma slowly rose to her feet, her body aching and battered, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air around her still felt heavy, thick with the malevolent presence of the maze. She had escaped the heart of the labyrinth, but the maze wasn't done with her. Not yet. She could still feel it. A presence, lurking in the shadows, watching from behind the rusted gate. The soft, slithering sound of vines echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder that the maze wasn't far behind. It was patient, waiting for her to make a mistake. Emma's skin prickled with the certainty that she wasn't truly free. Not yet. The maze was biding its time, waiting for the moment she would let her guard down. Her eyes darted around the chamber, scanning the shadows that flickered at the edges of her vision. The gate was closed, but that brought no comfort. The soft, persistent sound of rustling vines carried through the air. Like a serpent coiling just out of sight, the maze was watching. It was waiting, and it would come for her again. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she turned away from the gate, her eyes locked on the path ahead. Her breaths were shallow, her muscles tensed. She wasn't safe. The maze had let her go, but she knew it hadn't given up. It was still out there, lurking in the unseen corners, waiting for the perfect moment. The darkness seemed to pulse with life, the presence of the maze hanging over her like a shadow. She wiped the sweat and grime from her brow, trying to steady her trembling hands. The weight of the unseen gaze pressed heavily on her, urging her to move, to run. But she fought the instinct, knowing that any sign of weakness would invite the maze to strike. It was a game now, one she was barely surviving. With a final trembling breath, Emma steeled herself and took a step forward, her resolve hardening. She wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The maze had taken everything from her, her friends, her peace, and nearly her life. But it hadn't broken her. The vines hissed faintly in the distance, like a whisper of a promise. She knew, deep in her gut, that the maze was far from finished. It was watching, waiting for the moment she faltered. But Emma wouldn't give it that moment. Not now. Not ever. Her legs shook, but she forced herself onward. She wasn't just walking out of this labyrinth. She was defying it. The path ahead stretched into the unknown, winding and dark, but Emma didn't hesitate. She would keep moving. She would survive. But neither was the maze.